Welcome everybody to the Dave Langford lecture. I have with me Chrissy McCarthy. I am Vivian Chow from Loughborough University, and for the next hour or so, we're going to be talking about the politics of construction. That's the title of today's lecture. I might just should I waffle a bit while people get in, or is it instantaneous? I think it's instantaneous, isn't it? So I'll cut the waffle and go straight to the meat. To food metaphors. The Dave Langford lecture commemorates Dave Langford, and there is more information about that on the files download document you can see, which is on the right bottom corner of your screen. Also, I would really encourage you to take to read through that. And there is also, I should inform you that there has been a slight change in schedule for tomorrow's schedule, and Chris Nielsen will be sending everyone an email, but it is also on on the file that you can download. That is the updated version of tomorrow's schedule. So what I'm going to do, this is going to be fairly informal. We like to keep it fairly informal. So first, I'll just outline today's the purpose or the topic of today's presentation or today's lecture, and then I will introduce Chrissy. Chrissy has decided to, with my blessing, and I'm very excited about this. Chrissy has decided to not use a PowerPoint presentation, which is why you are seeing our faces giant on your screen, unlike in presentations throughout the day, which, by the way, I'm hoping that you guys have all enjoyed and had a chance to engage with the many discussions. I was chaired 2 of the sessions and engaged in a couple of the other ones, and was very impressed by the quality of the presentations. So this is something a little bit different. It's a live presentation, so a little bit more sort of stuttering like what you just heard, but hopefully that just leads to a more dynamic, sort of more exciting experience for us all. So what today's lecture is going to be about is the politics of construction. So we're talking about the little p of politics and how it has an impact not only on the immediate environments around us, but also how that impacts on the big P. So Chrissy is going to explain to us in her lecture what she means by big P and little p politics. Chrissy has is going to be taking a practitioner's view of how the intimate understandings about little p politics can illuminate the decisions of companies, governments, and clients. And she's going to reflect on personal experience as well as professional insights to investigate, explore, discuss how we can bridge the gap between little p and big P politics, and how we can strengthen the relationship between industry and academia. It sounds exciting. Really looking forward to it. So Chrissy is a founder of Construction Equality Limited. And before doing so, Chrissy has spent more than 10 years in the construction industry, firstly as a setting out engineer and then as a site manager. During this time, she played an integral role in the delivery of numerous projects, including the Pickham Library, Manchester Interchange, a range of BSF schemes, and a school in Uganda for charity. Together, these projects helped Chrissy to develop a deep understanding of the day-to-day practical challenges faced by teams on sites and at head offices around the country. Passionate about the social and economic impact of the construction industry, Chrissy went on to complete a postgraduate diploma in equality and diversity and is now in the final year of a PhD at Loughborough University. Considered one of the field's leading exponents, she is a regular contributor for prominent construction publications such as Building, Construction Manager, and Construction News. Chrissy actively engages with both academia and industry, which is, by the way, why we think that this is going to be such an exciting opportunity, I think, because I'm really looking forward to seeing the link between industry and academia in particular. She is committee member to ARCOM and to the Institute for Professional and Executive Development, and she is on multiple governmental strategic boards, such as the Image Group for 2025 Construction and the Industry Leadership Group for Fairness, Inclusion and Respect. So, without further ado, oh, actually, there is a little bit of further ado, just to keep everyone on their seats. Just to explain how this will work. So, as I say, our faces should be, I hope, giant on your screen. There is a series of buttons on the top right-hand corner of that interface. And from left to right, it says Collapse Video, Hangout View, and the third one is just the settings. So if you click on Hangout views, you are able to alternate between different types of views, and that's perhaps the that's up to you. I think as participant, as a attendee, I think you are able to do that. If not, then you're stuck with this view, which I think it's okay. It's not too bad. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you like, you feel free to leave some questions in the chat column, and we will go through them when the presentation is over. And I will also be moderating the presentation, the questions by opening up to the floor. Okay, now rewind back to what I was saying before. Without further ado, take it away, Christy.
Okay, so I've unmuted, so I think you have to mute, Vivian. Thank you for that lovely intro. Hi, everyone. So, going to be talking about, like Vivian said, the politics of construction. And so thanks for having me, and thank you for logging on. I really appreciate having someone to actually talk to. I'm hoping what I'm going to say is going to be interesting enough to keep you here for the next hour, but we'll see how I go. Eh? So when Lloyd approached me and asked me to give this year's Langford lecture for ARCOM, I was incredibly flattered. I love ARCOM an awful lot, probably too much. And I've always enjoyed the Langford lectures, from the ever interesting Fred Sherratt to last year's lecture by George Dennis Smith, which I still reference frequently. Now, as spoken before, Professor David Langford was known to champion the rights of workers, so social issues and people in construction. These are issues that I dedicated both my business, my research, quite frankly, my life to improving. They're issues that I hold incredibly dear. For me, that personal experience that we have in construction underpins everything else: our productivity, our creativity, and perhaps more importantly, our personal well-being. Now, as was mentioned before, I've had the pleasure of working on some remarkable buildings in my time as an engineer and site manager, from key projects like the Sterling Architects award-winning, if incredibly funky-looking, Peckham Library, to larger civil-based beauties like Manchester Transport Interchange. However, the project I hold most dearly is a bus station in Hyde. It's a project that's unlikely to be noticed by anybody who doesn't want to catch the 303 to Oldham. But for me, that little project encapsulated all that was brilliant about working in construction. Being part of a team that actually worked together, a boss that inspired me every day, and creating an outcome that we all just felt tremendously proud of. So today I'm going to talk about the ideas that underpin that experience in relation to the politics of construction. I want to take this time to think about the politics of the workplace around how we feel in the workplace, inclusion, perceptions of fairness, and consider how these experiences influence other people's big P and little p politics, intentionally or not. I do welcome questions at the end, especially the awkward ones. Got an eye on Bill over there. Please note, I'm not an academic. At best, I'm a person forever trying to finish a part-time PhD. My insights are more practical than theoretical, and I'm only hopeful that the topics that I cover today might inspire you to fill in some of the blanks, or at least educate me if you think you already know some of the answers. So to give a bit of context, Vivian Chow, the chair that you've just seen, introduced me to the expression, the idea of big P and little p politics. And so, broadly, big P politics is government and industry, leaders and CEOs, decisions made around the boardroom and filtered into our everyday lives, strategy and inequality, A-level algorithms and U-terms, HS2 and Hinckley, lockdown and furlough, both far removed and incredibly close to our everyday lives. For a definition of little p, I'm going to directly quote Smallford Janks because I just didn't feel like I'd better their sentiment. So they said, it's about the minute-by-minute choices and decisions that make us who we are. It's about desire and fear, how we construct them and how they construct us. It's about the politics of identity and place, the small triumphs and defeats. It's about winners and losers, haves and have-nots, school bullies and their victims. It's about how we treat each other day by day. It is whether or not we learn someone else's language or recycle our own garbage. This will be politics. Is about taking seriously the feminist perspective that the personal is the political. It's easy to see big P politics as something other people do and bad policy as a result of some sort of nefarious intent. I find the reality to be much more mundane, with less strategic evil geniuses with cats on their laps, and more overwhelmed or overconfident people making the best choices they can with often the little information that they know. I suggest that the bridge between those two Ps, the big P politics and the little p, is often shorter and much more heavily populated than some might think. So if we start with the little p, I think we all want to see ourselves as good. I mean, I know I do. We all want to think that we're the good guys. We justify and excuse our behaviours to fit the narratives that we've already created. Tools like confirmation bias are a brilliant help for this. We don't even know we're doing it, which makes it better. The truth is, our general attitudes do not always or often correlate with our specific behaviours. I'm going to use myself as an example for this. If you asked me at 19 what I would have done if I was ever sexually harassed in the workplace, I would have told you that hellfire would likely rain down. I would have shown you my strength and my force. I would have spoken in terms so absolute that you would have very likely believed me. But when it happened the first time, I had to accept my boss's decision that we didn't need to rock the boat, because I knew that there wasn't going to be any other decision. The second time, I didn't want the fella to lose his job. I knew he was going through a divorce and that his partner had been violent, and I understood that it wasn't right he was taking it out on me, and I thought that the additional stress of losing his job might hurt him. The third time, I simply had a mortgage to pay, and I'd seen enough, and I just couldn't risk any repercussions. You know, I come from a council house in Bracknell. There wasn't a trust fund backing me up here. So it seems like my hellfire wasn't even a light summer rain. The thing is, we see this in others too. So I laughed heartily when I watched like a news segment of a woman who had driven an hour and a half to get to the beach just after lockdown had unlocked. And she said in this news segment how terrible it was that all of these other people had come to the beach. And I remember sitting there with a friend of mine just cracking up about this crazy woman that she's driven all of this time to complain about the exact thing she's done. And then there was another segment with a guy in a beer garden drinking a beer, complaining about people using the pub and drinking beers because didn't they understand about COVID. And so me and my friend were laughing about this, like what incredible fools they were, can't they see they're part of the problem? And of course, ironically, my friend I was laughing with face to face and who I'd just given a massive hug to was still shielding. Now, of course, we used the positive impact that this was having on his mental health, because he has big mental health challenges. I've okayed this part of the speech with him. So yes, we used that mental health challenge as a mitigating reason that it was okay for us to meet up, that it was okay for us to hug. But there's always going to be a mitigating reason, isn't there? Our little p politics shape our world. The creation of these acts have the power to undermine policy, change practice, and create culture. But what powers them? What motivates me to stay quiet in the face of harassment? To break rules and hug my friend? And for him to ignore guidance that was generated to help him? One theory behind this is fairness. So fairness can be sort of understood in three ways. And for anyone that is an expert on fairness, I am clearly sort of bringing it down a lot today. Time, 40 minutes. So we can understand it as distributive, procedural, or interactive. So for distributive, I want you to imagine, say, I'd offered you a job with my company, and maybe I was going to offer to pay you, say, 70 grand a year. Like, if you need more, up it up, do the negotiations. Let's get to a sum you're happy with. So say you're on 70 grand a year, and you come and work for me, and then you find out that the person you're working alongside, same role, same responsibility, same qualifications, you can't see any real difference between anything between the two of you, really. They're on 80 grand a year. There's a 10 grand difference. So how did you feel now? Now, there's always a few that are happy, and you will have happy lives. But the majority of people suddenly don't feel so happy. See, we're not often as interested in what we get as we are in what we get in relation to other people, often known as relative deprivation. But it gets a little bit more interesting than that. If you were to have found out that the reason that someone else was on £10,000 more was because I've got a, well, economically awful, but great for you, policy that says for every year you're with the company, I'm going to give you an extra £10,000. You might start to feel a little bit better because you know the rule applies to you, it makes sense, it feels justified. That's our procedural justice. We've got one more thing on top of that, and that's our interactional justice. If I didn't bother to tell you about that yearly bonus, say until you've been working with the company for 6 months, you might find that you're frustrated, that you're annoyed, because why didn't I bother to tell you? Why are you left to stew on this for 6 months when you didn't need to be? Okay. You see this a lot with redundancies, where people have been made redundant. They'll say things like, I understand that they needed to make that decision. It was just the way they went about it. Why did they have to tell us in the end? If we think about it like that, I didn't report that abuse because I didn't think that anything would be done about it. Or I thought that the punishment would be disproportionate to the action. It wouldn't be just. Or that I didn't trust that my organisation would handle it fairly. The people on the beach felt that the rules were unfair, or that everybody was ignoring them anyway. When we perceive unfairness, we're motivated to act individualistically, ignoring rules and fearing difference in others. In extreme cases, we undertake deviant behaviours, either personal or organisation, to kind of rebalance the scales in our heads. When we perceive fairness, though, we're more motivated to follow rules, to work collectively, to help others. I've always found ARCOM is a wonderful example of that. I had a whole paragraph in here that my friend made me cut. He said it was far too cheesy, just extolling the virtues of ARCOM and everyone in it. But the way that ARCOM has always treated me so fairly, so kindly, makes me want to contribute so much more. Our perceptions of fairness can colour our attitudes, our behaviours, and our experiences. So let's keep that chain of thought and apply it into an organisational context. How does this manifest in organisations? How do those little politics, the fear and desire, impact the decisions that we make as organisations? Now, I would argue immensely. So let's consider equality, mostly because it's what I do, so it's what I know most about. So equality in organisations started out as equality of opportunity, where we were attempting to treat everybody the same, everybody equally. Then we kind of moved into diversity management, where it's much more about treating people as individuals. Now, for me, one of the big challenges that we've got at the moment is that whether it's equality of opportunity or diversity management, equality and diversity inclusion is seen as a problem to be overcome, which moves it away from company strategy. It's this often a side box over here, which doesn't help the organisation, wasn't seen to help the organisation achieve its goals, but rather is something that the organisation just needs to do. Now, I want to use mental health as an example of how this can manifest. So the challenges with mental health in the construction industry at the moment are just so troubling. You know, you're 4 times more likely to try and take your life in construction than any other industry. I think we're losing around 2 people a day to suicide. It's really worrying. And the reasons behind that are many. One, this kind of very male-dominated environment can really have an impact on people. So it's not necessarily that men are bad. Like, I've met a few, they're kind of lovely, but it's more the idea that when the majority of people that we're looking at look the same, we tend to try and fit into the stereotype of that group and stop behaving as who we are. There's a great example of that. This guy that I worked on site with once, he was a steel erector, and he was a very angry man, and he often had a hammer in his hand, so that was less terrifying. One day he comes barging into my office as I'm setting out for the prepping for my set out for the ground workers the next day, and he kind of, "Chris, have you got a minute?" But much more angry and a little bit more swearing. And I basically told him no, and he sat down anyway and slammed the door after him. And I was expecting this barrage of abuse, but instead what I got was a man crying at my desk talking about the fact that he was going through a divorce. And as he opened up, it turned out he was this kind of really sweet, gentle soul who liked flower arranging, which was the entire opposite from everything that he'd ever presented. And he'd almost been trying to hyper-prove his masculinity, because he didn't necessarily feel that way. When we have these sites that encourage people to act in this aggressive or masculine, hard way, it can really stop people from feeling able to talk, feeling able to be who they are. But then when we add that on top of these ideas around long hours culture, presenteeism, and already aggressive industry, and these are the things that keep coming back and saying that they're the biggest problems for mental health, is the long hours and the stress. We can start to see where this problem is coming from. Now, for me, one of the challenges is that when we come to the solutions for this, we're not trying to address the big challenges of long working hours and presenteeism culture. Instead, what organisations seem to be trying to do is have poster campaigns that ask people to talk to each other more, or employ people to take on roles as mental health first aiders. That's not to say these things aren't useful. It's to say that I think they're only useful if we're doing everything, not just one part of that. I think the best way to explain this is there's a guy called Chris Argalis who did some really nice work around change management. And he has this theory around single and double loop thinking. Forgive me if I butcher it. But he tells this story where there was a guy who was standing by a river doing some fishing, and he sees this body floating down the river. So he wades into the water and he drags this body back out, and he performs CPR or whichever, and the body comes back to life, and that's great. Then he notices another body floating down the river. But this time he decides to take up his waders, because he noticed last time they'd filled with water and it had slowed him down. So he goes and gets this body and he drags it out and again performs the CPR. And what he finds is that the minute that's happened, another body is floating down the water. Not a great day for him. But this time, instead of going to the water, he turns around and starts walking away. And the two people he's just saved turn around and say to him, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" He says, "I'm going to find out why the bodies are falling in." I see a lot of what we do in construction and equality simply is that. With that mental health problem, the talk to your mates campaigns, the first aiders, that's all this single loop thinking. All we're doing each time is taking off the waders. We're not really challenging the bigger problems. That walking up the bank, that's addressing presenteeism. That's looking at these long hours. That's looking at the massive amounts of stress and the aggression that are in construction at the moment. So what we really need to be doing is trying to tackle existing systems and mechanisms that are demonstrated to impact those short-term initiatives. Another example of this is the Black Lives Matter movement, which is so incredibly important at the moment. And I've seen a massive rise in companies writing things on LinkedIn. Now, I'm not 100% sure, but I am willing to bet a bit of money that the impact people writing things has on LinkedIn on people from the Black community isn't as great as it would be hoped. But one of the things I'm continually surprised about this is how many people don't really know the roots of racism. And I think if we did start to understand that, if we did start to educate ourselves on this, that would help us to move forward. So I'm going to give us a quick overview, and sorry for those that are history professors in the room. It is a light version. Well, when we talk about racism, people often will turn around if asked, what's the root of it, where does it come from, and say slavery. And but there's more people in slavery today than there ever has been at any point in time. And, the Irish were sent over to the West Indies as indentured servants, which isn't quite slavery, but it's very close. But, for a very long time before people from Africa were sent. To understand racism, what we really need to understand is what happened around the Enlightenment. So at the Enlightenment, as the church and the state were starting to separate, the idea that that slavery was bad came into being. People decided that actually we shouldn't be sending people into slavery. This wasn't a right thing to do. Now, whilst a lot of people were behind this idea, there was an awful lot of people that are getting very rich off slavery, and they weren't as bigger fans. And so they did what rich people can be very good at doing. They created a loophole. And the loophole was this. They kind of decategorized people with black skin and said that they were less human, less capable, less civilized. And by creating that categorization, which I hope I don't have to say, has got no basis in any truth whatsoever, but it allowed them to continue to put people into slavery. And over the years, this categorization stuck. You say that for enough times, people will start to believe it. And it's led to all manner of these little p political things, such as the idea that because people from the black community are less civilized has kind of over the years evolved into these kind of tropes or ideas of the angry black man. And that means that people from the black community, if they do show anger, are often treated less fairly and punished more harshly for it. This is inflected into people's behaviours then. And obviously, if we think about how that manifests in the workplace, in an aggressive workplace like construction, where the majority of the industry is being quite assertive with one another, and yet you've got another group of people that are being punished for it, we can start to see the bleed between big P politics, little p politics, and then how it starts to flip around. So why have these challenges arisen? So a number of factors might include EDI has been seen as a problem to be overcome. By EDI, so I mean equality, diversity, inclusion. Seen as a problem to overcome, not a way to achieve our organisational goals. This leads to us doing anything to show movement, rather something to show outcomes. The assumption that intending to do good is the same as doing good. I mean, this is such a dangerous assumption that we make, that any work that we do in the name of equality will automatically lead to a good outcome. And it's, of course, preposterous. We wouldn't expect that of anything. For example, imagine health and safety. Can we all agree that health and safety is a positive, useful thing that we would want to see on the site? I'm imagining you all cheer. Yay. Okay. So does that mean that everything that we do in the name of health and safety is therefore good? Perhaps not. I remember a site that I worked on where we decided everybody should wear glasses on the site, protective glasses, to make them safer, protect their eyes. Unfortunately, we didn't have much of a budget, so we bought the cheapest glasses going, and these things scratched pretty much as soon as you looked at them. So we technically just visually impaired everybody in the name of health and safety. And then we told ourselves we were great for doing it. Equality is the same. That emotional component, I think, can lead us to getting a bit carried away and assume the act of doing is the same as the act of achieving. That if my intent is good, then so will my outcome be. Secondly, I think a lot of equality work is driven by trends and not research, meaning unintended consequences are just not recognised. It's easy to stand on the sidelines as a researcher and blame industry for not engaging with the research. I think we must move towards understanding why academic research isn't being engaged with. Firstly, people are busy. In construction, people are just incredibly busy. We know this, we research this, we see this all the time. I felt this when I worked in industry. There just wasn't time. I averaged 60 hours a week. That was my basic. That was like the least I did in a week. If there was a concrete pour, that could easily go up to 70 or 80. Secondly, academic language can be really difficult and quite intimidating. For those of you that may have returned to academia, if you try and remember the first text that you read and how you felt about it, if when we have these language barriers for people, then you've got to understand that it can have an effect. It can be overwhelming for people as well. They don't know where to start or how to. And it's really difficult to know what good looks like. It's something I've always found really interesting, that what good looks like in industry is business reports and white papers. And then what good looks like in academia is something very, very different. And I'll be very honest with you, as someone that worked in industry, I didn't know that difference. And most people that I work with still in industry don't know that difference. So surely it's part of our job as researchers, if I include a little foot in the door as a researcher, to understand the way our populations consume information. Can we really put ourselves on pedestals of knowledge if we know that our work is not being engaged with, and yet we refuse to try and address this challenge? What do we research for? What do we write for? What do we do for? But don't get me wrong, there will always be a need for theoretical work that challenges thinking and pushes boundaries. And it is clearly not my wheelhouse. I find it so difficult to stick with theoretical and not go back to practical. Sorry for anyone that's ever tried to have a theoretical conversation. But I do find theoretical work incredibly important. It has shaped my thinking and ignited my ideas. But for those of us that create work intending to practically challenge and to provide recommendation, I would argue that there is a need to consider the medium that we deliver it in. Are we essentially writing in Arabic to an audience that only reads Mandarin, and then considering it their problem that we don't know what they're saying? Now, moving on to the idea of how these big P and little p problems manifest in clients, I think really similar phenomena occur when clients lead. The idea that we are good can be seen reflected there. Remember, the people that make decisions around well, anything, I'm going to stick with EDI, but around BIM, around the type of contracts that we use, they're still people. And I remember some extraordinary examples of how EDI has manifested from client demands. So I once worked on a project. I was about 4 years into my career, and I'd been given this role. I'd been working as a setting out engineer previously, and I've been given the role as a setting out engineer. And when I got there, the role was actually putting all of the furniture from the school, from a load of A3 drawings, into a computer. I'm honest, I'm not 100% sure the work needed to be done. And I was tasked with doing that for 6 months. And when I questioned why I was doing that work, when there was a setting out engineer who was just out of university and in way over his head and consistently asked me to help him, I was told that it was because the client had these equality, diversity and inclusion KPIs to get more women on site, and so they needed to fulfill them. I was essentially given a role without the responsibility and expected to be happy about it. Now, I don't think that there was any nefarious intent there. I think that was a bunch of people all thinking they were doing a great thing. The unfortunate thing was that really wasn't how it impacted me. I could have certainly found myself a job by that point in my career. This one looked really good. Unfortunately, it wasn't. And also, there's also the point that there's a lack of holistic consideration when we're looking at contracts. So, for example, I've seen contracts ask for, main contractors to meet OG regulations, so making sure they're giving everybody the opportunity to apply, plus also meeting 106 requirements, so making sure that they're also giving opportunity to people in the local area. And on top of this, they need to have a long and sustained supply chain. How do we meet all of those three things at once? And what happens if we realise we don't? Because for me, what I see main contractors doing is understanding they can't do everything the client wants. It's conflicting. And so they do what they think the client is going to need. So it leads to a fall down in all of this bigger P policy, which then translates as a smaller P policy as this equality stuff doesn't really work. And people start to react even further against it. Then if we think about how this manifests in government, for me, there's a lot about getting the right people in the room. I sat, as Vivian mentioned earlier, on an image subgroup. I think it was the 2025 strategy. It was a while ago. I've had a baby since then. Things are foggy. And I remember I was sitting in this room, we were talking about how do we improve the image of the construction industry. Pretty much everyone there was really keen on a billboard. I'm not too sure why, but that's where the focus was. And I remember saying there's 3.5 million people in this industry. Do you know what? A lot of them are not having a great time. I think that's where we need to focus our efforts, because they'll speak to people. And I certainly know when I first wanted to go into industry, the first things I did was speak to my dad that worked in the sector, or speak to friends' parents that did. We're not saying good things and what's going to happen. So anyway, after the meeting, chair, who said, I'm running these meetings for 6 months now, and nobody's mentioned that people are having a bad experience in construction. So far, they all seem very happy. So I said, okay, who's been in the room? And at this point, he kind of looked up and then went, well, I suppose it has all been directors. Who we have in that room is incredibly important. But then secondly, how we get them in the room is equally important. We can ask directors directly if we've got that personal connection with them. But what about finding people that are going to tell us a different story? You know, in community engagement, there's always that kind of rough joke that it's always going to be people that have retired coming in for the sandwiches because they've got the time and they want the food. Actually actively thinking about getting the people that you want into a room, that's something else. But also creating rooms that people feel able to engage with, because there's no point in having them there if the room doesn't feel right. Last year's Langford lecture by George Jenny Smith covered this beautifully, and I'm going to try and give an overview of it, but I'm going to butcher it. So sorry, George. He was talking about his work with the Indigenous communities in Australia, and he was saying how they looked at the sort of traditional methods like focus groups and found that actually to those communities, they often felt kind of aggressive. They felt that they'd been punished by them previously, so they were less likely to be methods that they would actually engage with. So instead, they spent some time with those communities to find out how they would speak, how they would talk to one another, methods that would suit them, and then they adapted their research to suit. And I just thought that was an incredibly powerful thing. As someone that works in equality and diversity, who's constantly trying to think like that, it always amazes me how many sort of potholes there are in my thinking, how many things that I just don't realize. And I wonder, you know, how many other examples there are of that. So who is in the room? Is the room appropriate? And then finally, are we asking the right questions in the right way? And for me, that's incredibly important. If we're only going to ask what type of billboard should we put up, then we fail to see if the billboard was the right thing we needed to place in the first place. Who we ask, how we ask, and what we ask. So of course, I'm talking about methodology, sampling, methods, and construct validity as much as anything else. But I do wonder, as Dennis Smith did, how much of those established processes we used were written by and for essentially middle-class white directors. How diverse and inclusive are our focus groups really if everybody in the room looks different but toes the same line? Do we need some of that deeper thinking that Chris Argalis was talking about? Why does any of this matter anyway? I do believe this short-term surface-level approach to challenges that doesn't appreciate the little p politics results in unintended outcomes and missed opportunities. Companies fail to see their return on investment, research isn't used, and because cost to the employees, I think, is far, far greater. We end up in environments that don't feel safe, don't feel welcome, don't feel okay. The reasons why it happens are vast. Just world syndrome is a personal favourite. I love the idea and I'm terrified at the same time that just world syndrome states that the world is just a little bit too big and a little bit too scary for our brains to comprehend. And so when we don't know enough about something, we kind of just say that it will be all right. And when we hear that it's not all right, we kind of justify that as the fault of one or two outrights. Other things that impact upon it are that confirmation bias that I spoke about before, the idea that, we just find the things that back up what we believe anyway. Groupthink is another phenomenon where we all start to act in the same way because we're part of a group, and we're very social animals. We don't always like to dissent. I really believe that our little p politics can shape, influence, and undermine our big P politics, and also that our big P politics shapes, influences, and undermines our little p. So how do we ensure success? Education is definitely a route. Lloyd Scott's spoken about micro-credentials, which I really like. In equality and diversity, there's the idea of microaggressions. There's lots of little small things that happen that create a bad environment. Micro-credentials are lots of little pieces of learning that create a bigger part of something. Really enjoyed that idea. I think creating cultures of learning, cultures of fairness that make people feel safe are incredibly important, as is holding senior leaders to account, demonstrating positive outcomes as opposed to just work. But actually, do we know how to positively affect these little p politics? If we did, might we have done it already? Might we have created a different industry? Are these questions we need to ask? Personally, as an overview, I believe our little p politics can be improved by being fair in the workplace, like holding ourselves personally for account and being the leadership that we want, not just expecting it from everybody else. Being understood. I don't think it's enough to have a message. I think you need to make it appropriate for your intended audience. I'm always struck by that kind of story of Edison. When people ask who invented the light bulb, most people will tell you Edison did. He really didn't. Like Tesla and a few others had clearly invented it before he did. What Edison was very good at doing was marketing. It's not enough to have a message. You need to make it appropriate. So I think you need to be fair. I think you need to be understood. And then I think you need to either be in the room or have the right people in your room. Otherwise, where is that message going? I think we need to think critically and learn to see objectively. We need to understand that our good intent does not equate good outcome, and we need to take responsibility and appreciate experts across disciplines, and understand that whilst we might be an expert in ours, we're not necessarily in others. But I think we also need to understand where and why research and education is not valued, and think about how that can be changed to challenge the thinking of the industry. Because if we fail to do this, if we fail to inform industry, what do we do this research for? To summarise, to improve big P politics through little p politics, I think we need to be fair, be understood, and be in the room. I think industry needs to appreciate the work of academia. I think education needs to think about how it communicates its message. We need to focus on those outcomes, not just that intent. And I likely need to get better at practicing what I preach and remember a little bit more about what I've ever learned. Thank you.
That was brilliant. That was absolutely brilliant. I was sitting there completely riveted. Really poignant message and beautifully executed. Have I muted you by mistake, or have you just been talked out?
No, I muted myself to avoid feedback.
So sorry. So we'll have to take it in turns a little bit. No, as I was saying, beautifully executed speech. And I really loved that you hinged the narrative on different examples, and then the examples were set at different levels, and it sort of prompted me to think about the connection between these different levels. And by that I mean, by different levels I meant, sort of on the personal level, and then on the societal level, but also client and organizational level, policy versus commercial decisions versus very personal decisions as well. So a lot to think about, and I think you really linked the big P and the little p beautifully, and I got a lot out of that, and I found it really, really engaging. Okay, so enough gushing from me. I can see that there's quite a few questions in the chat. So for those of you who have been writing in the chat function, thank you so much for posting your questions. I haven't looked at them yet because I was sort of completely glued to the screen, but I'll read them out now. So shall we just start from the top? How many have we got here? 2, 3. So 3 questions. So let's start with that, and then I might then open up the floor, adjusting for time and so on, to gather more questions. So the first one is from Philidis. How do we address equality and equity in construction? I ask, as these related terms are not the same, yet they are enacted on sites in reality.
Yeah, so this is basically part of the PhD that's never finishing. For me, it's incredibly important. I think there's a link between when people don't sense fairness or equity, they tend to act more individualistically, because if my company's not going to look after me, I've got to look after myself. When we are more individualistically, we tend to perceive difference as a threat. And so if you imagine it this way, if I work for a company that I don't trust, that I don't think is fair, then I'm going to act more individualistically. I'm going to perceive a threat. If someone now puts an equality and diversity initiative into that environment, I'm not likely to respond very well to it. Whereas, with such hope, if we work for a company that we do trust, that I do believe is fair, that I do think is going to look after me, then I don't perceive difference as a threat. I perceive difference as something that has value to the organisation and therefore to me. And so therefore, equality and diversity, I think, has a chance of going. And I think the big problem with equality, one of the challenges equality is facing at the moment, not just in construction, is that we haven't necessarily addressed fairness or equity. We've just gone straight to dealing with equality. And especially in an industry like ours, we have so many people that do feel unfairly treated. It feels like their concerns are being ignored, but the concerns of another group aren't. And it generates this very strange thing where people think that these kind of the outgroups or the groups that we tend to target with equality and diversity are actually having an easier ride. And so this kind of double bang comes into play. So I think the first thing that we need to do to address equality is to improve the way that we treat everybody on site, well, not just on site, within organisations, and generate an overall feeling of fairness. What happens after there, I think we need to then move on to addressing inequality and then start to look at equality, so bringing people in. But I think if we don't do it in those steps, we're just going to be doomed to repeat this cycle forever.
I think that example that you gave about the story of the people floating down the river and then actually stepping back and going back upstream, that makes it so difficult, doesn't it? Because things are happening and we feel like there is a lot of things need to happen, a lot of actions need to take place, but actually by getting stuck in that single loop, we are ignoring the cause of the problem. So I think that's a really good point. That's a food for thought there.
It is, and it's something that I fall into all the time. You have to actively work to be out of it, and I don't really blame people in industry for being where we are in equality, because there's so much pressure. There's not really that time to be able to step back and think.
Okay, I'll just go to the next question. Neil asks this question. Most companies pay lip service to mental health first aid and aren't interested in employees with mental health issues beyond day-to-day anxiety that may be solved with a short period of work and some reassignment of responsibilities. But we'll fall over themselves to collect the best MHFA employer award, so to speak. more comment, I guess. Maybe just respond to the comment, and also maybe just how do we get out of that cycle?
Yeah, so in my work, because it's not always true, but I've seen kind of like two ends of the scale. There's companies that really genuinely care about doing something and creating cultures. They tend to not win many awards, and the reason why is because they don't tend to put themselves forward for them. It's just what they do. It's just seen as the thing they do. That's not the reason they're doing it. Then on the other end of the scale, there's some companies who aren't necessarily doing a lot of work. They're very good at writing and winning awards because that's the reason why they're doing it. There's companies in between, of course, but you see this a lot. And for me, one of the big challenges of that is if I'm someone who's concerned about my mental health and I want to find an employer who will look after me, then I might go to the one that's winning all of the awards. And then when I get in there and I find that that's not a place where I feel safe and I feel okay, it might make me feel that if this was the best, does this mean that there's nowhere to go? So I completely agree that there are companies that are paying lip service to mental health. I think there's a number of reasons. I think a lot of practitioners are selling mental health first aid as the answer to everything, and people are trusting them as experts. And I think we need to get wiser to what's a trend sold product and actually what's backed up by research. But I think some companies as well are just doing the thing that they need to do. And and clients play a part in this as well. It's a big picture, it's a big problem. But I think that there are also definitely some companies that are working extraordinarily hard. And it's just we don't see them as much.
I think you raised a really good point as well about sort of how do you measure these things, right? How do you measure it? How do you benchmark it? This sort of best practice thing. Yeah, you can give someone a best person award, or you can just be a good person. It's one of those things, isn't it? Okay, I'll just go to the next thing. So this is promising. It starts with is, which usually means that it is a question. Let me read it. Is/are. Oh, this is by Chris, by the way. Chris goes. Is/are inequality and inequity and inequality being used by those in power to further divide the underprivileged? I can't help thinking that those with the most bigoted positions in power rub their hands when the underprivileged starts arguing about which groups have suffered the most. What can be done to unite and bring about greater empathy and support, as well as addressing inequality? That's a great question.
Absolutely. My conspiracy theory goes much wider. But, I think that divide and conquer is always a great plan, isn't it? Like if you just want to have power and not necessarily have people treated very well, it's just something that people in power have always done. Is separated groups, got them to argue amongst one another about which one's worse. I mean, if we think about fairness and that idea around when we feel treated unfairly, when our resources are taken from us, when we're worried, when we're scared, we act more individualistically and we're scared of difference. Well, I'm talking about 10 years of austerity there, as much as I'm talking about anything that's happened in an organisation. And so then to see Brexit happen after that, I just don't think it's that surprising. And I don't think it's because we're a country full of necessarily terrible people. These are sociological principles that happen quite broadly. I think if you make people feel scared, that's how people respond. And I don't necessarily think that we designed to do that in construction. Not necessarily saying that the government did, but I don't think we designed to do it in construction necessarily. But I think that maybe that has been an outcome nonetheless. What can be done to unite and bring about greater empathy and support? The one thing that seems to be best at working is, I think the sheriff said, was having, I had a lovely word for it, superordinate task. So, pulling people together under one big idea. And so there's been lots of lovely work done with groups. And you split those groups, they fight together, but if you give them one task to work on together, suddenly all of those differences seem to melt. You've got something to focus on, you need one another. So I think it's that. And for me, when I work with clients, I try and get them to really focus on selling the benefit of the company as a whole and how working together to achieve that. That's, for me, that's what I think works.
Brilliant, brilliant. Let's. What I'm going to do is.
Oh, people are kind.
Oh, there's a. Oh, I was going to open it to people to speak, to ask their questions, but actually more people have written via chat. So if you don't mind, I'll
let them speak. Let them speak.
let them speak. I don't know. Well, I don't know how we'll go with time. Let's go through this first. Will COVID-19 help or hinder the progression of this agenda in the construction industry? So that's by Craig. Question by Craig. Very topical question.
Funny enough, I've just been writing a thought piece on that for IPED journal, the Interdisciplinary Perspective on Equality and Diversity. And so I think it's going to massively hinder. So I'm going to use the stats for women in construction, and simply because we've got those stats and we don't really have it on many other groups. In 1996, the stats for women in construction were around 13%. Then they going up a bit. In 2006, 2007, I think we were about 13.8%. And then what happened between 2008 and 2009, it dropped down to around 11%. And we have spent the last 10 years getting back up to 13%. So last year, there were more women in construction as a percentage. The percentage of women in construction, was greater in 1996 than it was last year at one point. And that's a worry, isn't it? And I think part of the reason for that is, there will be elements of women being let go during the recession, etc. But I think one of the bigger problems is retention. So women tend to stay in their careers in construction for, sort of 5 to 10 years. And the reasons for that aren't the jobs. It seems to be consistently the experiences that people are having, these microaggressions that keep building up and send that message that you're not really welcome here. And so the challenge is that if we're losing women at a rate of every 5 to 10 years, if we have a period where we are not employing people into the sector, we're going to see that gap happen again. So when we've got this recession through COVID, I think we're going to have that. So I think that's one big problem. And I think that will affect the BAME, so Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic communities, as well as any other community. And also on top of that, I mean, let's be realistic. The people that have been treated worse in construction, I think, are the people on site. And it's the same as health and safety. We look at the big sites, they seem to be doing a lot better. We're looking at the smaller sites. Again, I don't know that people are being treated well. And it worries me. It worries me an awful lot, especially for someone who has people that I love that still work in the construction industry. Are they being treated as well as we'd hope? So yeah, I think equality and diversity has an awful lot to do with how safely people are being treated and COVID.
Some sobering thoughts there.
Yeah, sorry.
No. But let's have a couple more. Let's see if we can round off the discussion differently. What are your thoughts about the extent to which societal values impact on our sector? There's some preamble to this actually. Oh yeah, it's just saying that thinking about the small P and big P, but then the question is about the extent to which social values impact on our sector.
Yeah, it's a tricky one really. An awful lot, not at all. I think it really depends upon the group that people are in, and also they're often away from it. So like the guy that I was talking about that came into my office and started crying. Like you met him out on site and he was furious and angry and aggressive all of the time. And that was part of, his idea of what construction was. So he fitted into that mold. But then when I spoke to him in the office, he was a completely different man, completely different. And he had these really strong views and values and beliefs. And that was part of the reason why he was so furious and angry all the time, is because of that perceived conflict. So sometimes I worry that in construction, part of our identity is to create a bubble, that we are perhaps different and stronger. Like I always laugh at how people tell me that how hard you have to be to work in construction. You know, this is for hard, solid people. I spent 6 months in nursing before I came into construction. 6 months was all I can handle. And let me tell you this, the hours were longer and I had to work nights. The work was just dirtier. What can come out of people and how far it can travel. Honestly, it's just, I've had to clean it up. Ceilings, they can get it on ceilings. And, you know, and it's heavier. It genuinely is. And if you don't believe me, try getting an 82-year-old war veteran with an erection out of the bath. Like, that is harder, stronger work than I had to do in construction. Bags of concrete are much more valuable to work with. But the idea is that in construction, we do this strong work with these hard people. And I just don't know, for me, that the myths always represent the reality. And that isn't to say that the work that we do isn't hard. It's just to say that there's a lot of different work that's hard that doesn't need or doesn't feel the need to have that. So therefore, we must be strong and mean narrative that goes alongside it.
Yes. I like the idea that it's the narrative behind the work that we do. I mean, not to say that that diminishes how hard the work is, but it's this sort of not myth. That's a bad word. But yes, the legend, maybe, you know, something that we build around the profession that we have to try to give it some identity, and then we hold on to that, don't we?
Absolutely, and I think that it's also there to serve a purpose. I think sometimes it's there to serve so only men can do this purpose. You know, you weak woman who can't lift the hammer, that's all right, I can. Well, now, I haven't done that in a while. But I think that's part of the mix, is to let in who we want to let in. And yet actually, we let in a lot of, you know, weak men as well as strong men. So I don't know. So,
and we're strong in different ways as well.
Aren't we just? Like, I created a human being. That rocks.
Yeah. So I am conscious of time, and I think this is more a comment. I'll read it.
That's a good
To
one.
be a comment. Is there anyone want to ask any final short and sharp question that can be easily answered? Maybe with just a yes and no. No, just joking. But if there are any burning questions, please post it now. Oh, this is a great. Let's end with this one. I like this so much. Is academia more macho than construction?
My experience of academia is ARCOM, the people that I'm working with at the University of Manchester, and my supervisors, Andrew Dainty, Sarah Barnard, and Derek Thompson. And they're all just delightful people. And not to say that people on construction work, they were also delightful people, but I've just never had, it's just been this sort of like idyllic loveliness. People have just always been so kind, so nice. No one's threatened to punch me in the face. Which is always a good start. No one's called me, to be polite, see you next Tuesday. And not to say that those things are necessarily, well, I think they're part of actually a macho culture. No, I don't think that academia is more macho than construction. I found academia personally to be kinder and more considerate, which isn't to say that it's perfect, but just comparatively, it's a different environment, and one that I've enjoyed differently. I also enjoyed the other stuff too.
Thank you for that, and thank you everybody for posting questions. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot more discussion around this. I'm sure that this has generated a lot of food for thought. There's going to be a social function after this session. So, Chrissy, are you going to be there?
Yes, I am. Oh, I've got to go pick the kid up though. Sorry, I nearly forgot. I've got to pick my baby up and then I'm going to be joining.
Okay, sure. Maybe with the baby?
Quite possibly. I don't know. My husband's opening a framework in Real, so I don't know what time he's back.
Possibly with the baby. So please join us for more of an in-depth chat. And sorry about not opening up for sort of, you know, a voiced discussion, but we had so many questions coming from the chats that it has completely, you know, filled in the hour and a bit more. So I look forward to continuing the discussion at the social function as well as onto tomorrow in tomorrow's sessions and in tomorrow's social spaces. I hope everyone had a really good time at this lecture, and I hope that everyone had a good day today as well, the first day of ARCOM, the first day ever of virtual ARCOM. And I look forward to engaging with your tomorrow, continuing to engage with you tomorrow. Okay, I'm going to, I think what I do now is I have to close the session. So thank you, everybody,
Thank you all.
and see you soon.